All right, my name is Dr. Joseph Zompetti. I'm from Illinois State University in the United States. And today we will have a demonstration debate on the topic, which is up here: should the Japanese government prohibit the import, production, and sale of all genetically modified foods? On the affirmative in our demonstration debate, we have Shanna Carlson, also from Illinois State University. And on the negative side of the debate, we have Jacob Nickell, who's also from Illinois State University. So they will give their speeches in a traditional policy format, and then when it's concluded, I will say some comments about my thoughts on the debate.
Observation 1 is inherency. Japan imports 44 different types of genetically modified crops and has strict testing policies. U.S. Department of Agriculture, Foreign Agricultural Service, 2003. Japan has approved 44 GM crops for food use. 30 foods are currently subject to JAS labeling requirements. Therefore, I offer the following plan. The Japanese Ministry of the Environment, MOE, the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare, MHLW, and the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries, MAFF, will ban all importation, sale, and production of genetically modified foods. Observation 2 is solvency. A. The MOE is responsible for Type 1 cases for GMOs. Alien Species and LMO Regulation Office, 2010. The MOE manages Type 1 use cases depending on the purpose and use, because MOE need to decide whether the uses in open system affect biological diversity or not. B. The Japanese MHLW and MAFF are responsible for GMO legislation. Vasquez, accessed March 2014. The MHLW has been in charge of food safety, while the MAFF has overseen GMO food labeling under JAS. The advantage is marine ecosystems. A. Japan's water sources are vulnerable. Ishikawa proves this. Agbula, October 2011. The main vulnerable areas of the coast seem to be the Southern District. Living and non-living resources have been grossly impacted by human-induced environmental changes. The Ishikawa coast has come to require human attention and increased management. B. GMOs are responsible for contaminating water sources worldwide. Barrett, 2012. One groundbreaking study found that the active ingredient residing in the Roundup product from Monsanto is making its way into groundwater. The explosive study discovered that 41% of 140 groundwater samples were above the limit. The findings indicate that glyphosate doesn't break down rapidly in the environment and is building up in concerning qualities. It is becoming more apparent that the chemical is polluting groundwater in alarming quantities, enough to pose a significant threat to the purity of drinking water wherever it is used. Glyphosate is sprayed in massive amounts in order to function properly against the resistant crops. C. The impacts. I have many. The first is aquatic ecosystems are critical to all ecosystems. International Ecosystem Management Partnership, 2012. The breakdown of organic matter in water bodies is a critical ecological process since it determines the availability of food resources that support large and complex food webs in aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. Crop debris serves as an important source of energy and nutrients in agricultural aquatic systems. Changes in terrestrial inputs following human-induced disturbances have the potential to perturb the in-stream food web processes that provide these valuable ecosystem services. 2, agroecosystem biodiversity is key. The Convention on Biodiversity Alliance, 2010. Healthy, productive agroecosystems are very diverse. A single Japanese ecosystem has been shown to contain 5,668 different species. Without rich biodiversity, food futures are bleak. Yet, agricultural biodiversity is being lost at alarming rates. We have lost at least 75% of crop varieties and thousands of livestock breeds over the past century, and all agricultural biodiversity are under threat of irreversible and drastic erosion, due mainly to the expansion of monoculture industrial production systems using agrochemicals and producing effluents that pollute downstream, uniform seeds, and over-harvesting of aquatic and marine species. With that, I stand open for cross-examination.
First, I just want to make sure, what all does the plan do?
All the plan does is it bans any kind of GMO from being produced, so grown or harvested. It also, in Japan, it also prevents the ability to import products that have GMOs in them to Japan, and you cannot sell anything that has a GMO in it while in Japan.
Why is it important to ban the importation of GMOs?
The reason we need to ban the importation of GMOs is because those GMOs could get into our water supplies. They can also come over here and they can continue to grow if a seed that is different from what we usually plant comes here. And so then we can't contain it and it becomes too big of a problem to solve. So we have to use more of these herbicides and contaminate our water even farther.
Okay. Are there GMOs being produced in Japan right now?
Currently, right now, there are 44 that are imported and 30 that items that have to be labeled as having GMOs in them.
So if items are being imported now, there is a risk that these items have already contaminated Japanese crops.
What we're saying is that risk that they could have already contaminated can be reversed and solved so we don't have future problems.
How do we get rid of GMO crops that are already being grown right now?
What we're saying is we won't allow the problem to get worse.
Okay. I'd like to ask a question about your advantage. Your Barrett evidence, in the part of it that you do not read, explains that there are other causes to water pollution than GMO herbicides.
That's correct.
Okay.
However,
how can you solve for all of water pollution if you're not getting rid of all these other causes?
what we're saying is the biggest cause is that there is the glyphosate and other such chemicals because we're having to constantly use more of it.
Okay.
So the only way to ensure that we don't over pollute the water is to stop using GMOs.
Okay. So without GMOs, do farmers no longer use herbicides?
They don't have to use as much or as dangerous of chemicals.
Okay. You read a piece of evidence from the Convention on Biodiversity Alliance that
Yes.
explains that over the past thousands of years, ecosystems have been damaged. Right?
What we're saying is the convention, oh yes, I'm sorry. What that card says is that over the last century, so in just the last 1,000 years, we've lost 75% of crop varieties and that we've lost thousands of livestock breeds.
Thank you. First, I would like to present an off-case position. which is my wheat disadvantage. First is uniqueness. GMO wheat is being developed in the United States now, but the government won't approve its sale if there is no demand. This is Lusk and Miller, 2014. Monsanto had made significant progress in the development of herbicide-tolerant wheat. It will enable farmers to use more environmentally benign herbicides and could be ready for commercial use in the next few years. But the federal government must first approve it, a process that has become mired in unscientific regulation. The scientific consensus is that existing genetically engineered crops are as safe as the non-genetically engineered hybrid plants that are a mainstay of our diet. The government should be encouraging these technologies. The world's leader in agricultural genetic engineering scrapped its effort to modify wheat in 2004 because of opposition from North American grain merchants and growers who were worried that some major foreign countries would reject imports of all American wheat. Since then, many growers now want access to genetically engineered varieties. 2 is the link. Allowing U.S. farmers to grow GM wheat hinges on global demand. Plan will signal that nobody is interested. This is Ratner, 2013. The reason GM wheat was never brought to market is not an issue of safety, but one of economics. For the United States, wheat is a highly exported commodity, but there was concern that if the country started growing GM wheat rather than natural wheat, the U.S. would lose global market share because the demand for GM product wasn't there. 3 is the impact. U.S. development of GMO wheat is vital to globally solve food scarcity. This is Lusk and Miller, 2014. Corn, soybeans, and wheat account for a vast majority of the value of America's agricultural crop output. But wheat is different in one important respect. While more than 90% of the nation's corn and soybean acres are now planted with seeds genetically engineered, there is not a single acre of genetically engineered wheat being grown commercially in the United States. Wheat farmers have suffered as a result, as have consumers who have been paying higher prices, because fewer and fewer acres are planted in wheat. Without the benefits of the newer molecular techniques of genetic engineering, the nation's wheat industry will continue to struggle against other commodities that have adopted biotechnology. All of this is happening as the planet's population increases and global wheat demand expands in response. Wheat farmers missed out on perhaps the most important benefit of genetic engineering, the development of crops that can survive droughts or grow with lower quality water. Some importing nations are deeply concerned about their food security and have only limited opportunities for growth in domestic production. They should be receptive to genetically engineered wheat. Now that I've presented my off-case position, I'd like to go to Shanna's observation 2 about solvency. Now, all crops contain some GMO elements. Japan won't be able to get rid of them completely, which means that she can't solve her advantage. This is from Charles in 2014. Separation doesn't work. Companies know that they have to tolerate small traces of GMOs. How do you even define GMO-free? We cannot hit a 0 standard. People need to know that GMO-free means that something contains no more than 0.9% of GMOs. And even without the plan, Japan already avoids planting GMO seeds. This is from Bayer in 2011. The Japanese people are staunchly opposed to genetically modified crops, and no GM seeds are planted in the country. Now that I've addressed Shanna's solvency observation, I'd like to go to her advantage. Now, her pesticide data is flawed. The only conclusion is that GMOs lead to milder chemicals. This is from Johnson in 2013. For one thing, the data on agricultural pesticide use is patchy and prone to interpretation. And although government numbers show an increase in total herbicide use, farmers have been using much milder chemicals. Now that I've read a piece of evidence on this advantage, I would like to point out a few further flaws with it. First, her Barrett evidence, as I explained in cross-examination, goes on to explain in the parts that she doesn't read that there are many other factors that can contribute to water pollution in Japan. You can think of just a couple examples off the top of your head, I'm sure. Overfishing, other chemicals that are being dumped into the water. So there's no way that just banning GMOs is going to solve for water pollution. And even if it gets rid of a little bit of that water pollution, she reads her impact evidence, explains that an ecosystem collapse takes hundreds of years. She explains this again in cross-examination, that ecosystems have been disintegrating for over 100 years. And there has been no impact to this. There is still food in Japan, as I'm sure that you are all aware. And further, this has been occurring before the existence of genetically modified organisms, which means that not just pesticide use causes the collapse of ecosystems. And with that, I am open for cross-examination.
I just want to make sure that I understand your story that you're telling me on the DA.
Yes.
Can you, in your own words, explain it, please?
Yes. The United States is beginning to develop genetically modified wheat right now, which is very important to increase the amount of wheat that is produced in the world to feed the growing population of the globe. However, there will only be a market for genetically modified wheat if the United States feels that it can export to other countries.
Is this genetically modified wheat that we're going to be growing, is it mostly produced by Monsanto, and is it Roundup resistant like their other GM products?
That is one form of the wheat. However, the evidence goes on to indicate that there are other genetic modification companies that are producing this wheat.
But which one right now is winning on that market? Is it Monsanto or some little company that you don't have a name for?
It's not a question of winning on the market. Monsanto is the most significant company that exists for genetic modification, yes, but there are other companies. And it's not a question of solving for herbicides. Really what we're focusing on is moving towards wheat that is drought resistant.
Okay, so on the droughts, let's talk about that. You're saying that there's places that are having less and less water, correct?
Yes.
So, so are we having to use more pesticides to grow this wheat in these drought areas?
The evidence that I read on your position says that, do we use more pesticides now? Yes, but we have moved to milder chemicals. For example, glyphosate is much milder than alternatives that were used before GMOs.
However, did you ever answer where I stated that glyphosate doesn't actually break down in the environment like the other chemicals we use do?
Do I make an explicit comment on that? No, but that evidence indicates that glyphosate is much safer for the environment. Your evidence is not comparative. It just says that glyphosate is problematic.
But that's fine, I'll argue that in my speech. Let's go to your other on-case arguments. You're stating that all GMOs, or that everything is going to have a GMO in it, correct?
Yes.
Eventually?
Yes.
Okay. How is a natural form of a genetic modification different than a scientific change?
I'm not sure.
Okay, so why would a natural change be just as bad as a scientific change?
My argument isn't that one would be bad. It's just that if GMO cross-contamination, as you discussed, is going to happen, that means that genetic modification is always going to be present in crops.
Okay, thank you. All right, first let's look at plan, and we're going to go to the solvency where Jake made a couple of arguments. He first stated that we can't completely get rid of all GMOs, that we're going to constantly have them. My first response to this, though, is that he is not looking at how I tell you the problem comes from the scientific, where humans are going in and interfering with genes. I don't contend that natural differences don't occur and that that's not a good thing. I'm saying that when we manipulate the genes as humans and we make it into something it's not supposed to be naturally, that's a bad thing. Having a gene naturally change through cross-pollination or evolve to become more drought-resistant on its own, yes, that's a good thing, and we would contend that should happen, but that can't happen when humans are going in and actively changing. And so that's why Japan needs to stop GMOs now so that the natural seeds can begin to develop on their own and develop to the point where they can solve the problems that Jake is talking about with drought resistance, which shows that Japan doesn't need to worry about those natural alterations. On the advantage, Jake talks about how these pesticides he's talking about are milder and that they're not as bad for the environment. But what I want you to remember is when I read to you from the advantage about how bad glyphosate is that originally, when we were looking at it, we thought it broke down very quickly in the environment. And that's why it was milder, and that's why it solved the problem. However, Jake does not answer the argument coming from my card from Barrett that says that glyphosate does not break down in the environment and is continually building up in quantities and getting worse and worse and worse the more we use it. So while it's milder, it's a bigger problem because we have to use more of it. And unlike other herbicides that we've used and other pesticides, it doesn't go away and get broken down. It just hangs out and stays. That's the problem. So his evidence is not specific to what I'm telling you. Additionally, he says that there's other things that cause the problem. But what you need to remember is that the affirmative is saying that this is the biggest problem because it stays around the longest and because we're constantly using more, which means the only way to solve the biggest problem is to stop GMO production. Next, he says that it's taking too long and we've been collapsing for forever. But what we're saying as the affirmative is that we're at that tip. We are so close to having huge problems that we could never predict because of how many species we're losing, how many types of crops we don't have. He's worried about having drought resistance, but without the affirmative, we can never guarantee that there are those natural things that can occur to allow for the drought resistance to happen. So on Jake's disadvantage, Jake wants you to think that having this genetically modified, human-altered wheat is going to save the world's hungry. He's missing a couple of things. I want you to go down to his impact where he tells you that this GM wheat is going to solve all of the food crisis. We're going to be able to grow it in drought areas. I have a couple of responses. My first is that this would contaminate the water, that precious little water that's left in those drought areas with more glyphosate. So the problem on case that I'm talking about, he's going to make worse, which means my impacts are going to happen even faster now. My second is that GM crops threaten food security. This is from Rubinson, 2013. From the perspective of food security and the future of agriculture, GM seeds are a disaster. GM agriculture is an extension of current industrial farming practices that have resulted in the contamination of land and water, severe health issues, and the loss of family farms and farmer livelihoods worldwide. My number two is that natural crops outperform GM crops. This is from Rubinson, previously cited. GM seeds were outperformed by traditional agroecological farming practices, We strongly object that the image of the poor and hungry from our countries is being used by giant multinational corporations to push a technology that is neither safe, environmentally friendly, nor economically beneficial to us. We do not believe that such companies or gene technologies will help our farmers to produce the food that is needed in the 21st century.
My first question has to do with the effect of your plan on the world.
Okay?
Now, your plan only bans GMOs in Japan, correct?
Correct.
So no other country is going to ban GMOs along with your plan.
We would argue that it would end up happening that way. If you would like to make that argument, I can respond to it in my next speech.
Well, I'd like to ask now, why would other countries ban GMOs just because Japan did?
Because there's a lot of countries that are actually looking to import from countries that don't use genetically modified. So what we're saying is that as Japan moved into the market and started dominating because they can ship out products that are GM-free, other countries would want to be able to compete with that, so they would stop allowing GM crops to be grown as well.
Okay. I have a question about one of your responses to my wheat disadvantage. You say that an increase in genetically modified wheat will increase droughts in the countries that would buy the wheat, right?
What I argued is that it would actually contaminate the water in those countries that are suffering from drought because of the use of glyphosate.
Right. My argument is that the countries that are so desperately in need of wheat because of food scarcity are in need of wheat because they can't grow it themselves. So if they do not have the means to grow wheat and are just buying it after it's been harvested, how does that contaminate water sources?
Well, when I asked you in Cross-X earlier, when I asked, you said that you were going to be able to grow it in drought-resistant areas, not that you would just be selling it to those drought-resistant areas. So my response to that was that having that genetically modified crop in a drought-resistant area growing would inevitably have to use more chemicals.
Okay. The first piece of Rubinson evidence indicates that genetically modified crops are bad for food security.
Correct.
Could you please explain why?
Yeah. It's where Rubinson states that it's because of the contamination to the land and the water, and that these GMOs have caused severe health issues, and that small farmers are actually being put out of business, which is destroying the economy of those countries.
Okay. I have two quick other questions. You say that glyphosate does not break down in water, right?
Correct. That comes from the 1AC.
Right. So the amount of glyphosate that is in water now because of GMOs is never going to go away.
What
right?
I'm saying is it slowly breaks down, and because we have to use more and more of it, it's never allowed to completely go away because it's constantly being reintroduced at really high levels. Eventually, it will break down.
Thank you. I will take some prep time. In this speech, I'm going to begin by talking about Shanna's solvency evidence. Okay? Now, first, I want to extend across my argument the Charles and 14 evidence that explains that all crops have a GMO element. Now, I want to direct you to cross-examination after the first affirmative constructive speech. When we discussed how we don't want to import, she says that we don't want to import other crops because the mere presence of other crops can cause cross-contamination. That is scientific engineering that she's talking about that's harmful, that we can't get rid of, even with the plant when the plan is in place. Charles explains that there are virtually no crops in the entire world now that are completely GMO-free, which means that the problems she is discussing are always going to exist. There will always be a need to use other types of harmful herbicides to control the environment, if you buy her argument that these herbicides are indeed harmful. Second, I want you to extend across the Bayer 11 evidence that indicates that even though Japan does not have a ban on the production or import of GMOs right now, there isn't anything being grown right now in Japan. So even if I lose the argument that I just made above about how cross-contamination from other countries is always going to happen, without the plan, Japan is already avoiding growing genetically modified crops, which means that the use of the herbicides she is indicting in her argument is very, very minimal right now, okay? Which means that there is no need to do her plan. Now, let's go to the ecosystem's advantage. I want to first extend across the Johnson in 2013 evidence that I read in the previous speech. It explains that first, you should hold her evidence about how herbicides are bad at a very high degree of skepticism. My Johnson author, who is an agricultural professor at the University of Massachusetts, explains that this type of research is highly questionable. It is poorly conducted and is held to a high degree of interpretation that environmentalists have used to further their own political agendas. So what that means is that you should question her arguments about these pesticides being bad. What is certain is the fact that glyphosate, even if we have to use more of it, is still less destructive than other chemicals we would use in its place. So if we have no GMOs, we will use more harsh chemicals that are worse for the environment, okay? Second, she says that glyphosate does not break down, and that right now we are on the brink of environmental collapse. Well, if that's true, even if we do the plan and ban GMOs right now, there is still going to be glyphosate in Japanese water, which means that your ecosystem is still at risk even with the plan. So if that is inevitable, it is better to err on the side of the status quo and at least be able to provide wheat to hungry people in developing countries. Also, GMOs still reduce the need for insecticides. This is also from Johnson in 2013. The pesticide treadmill describes a problem that consistently occurs in agriculture. It goes like this. Eventually, insects evolve resistance to an insecticide, so the farmer starts using more sprays or something more toxic. As time passes, the farmer becomes more and more dependent on chemicals as the only means of pest control, using larger amounts or more severe poisons and getting less benefit. But transgenic, insect-resistant crops have turned this process around. These plants produce proteins from a widespread bacterium that only harm a narrow set of insects. Bt itself is widely used as an insecticide, mostly by organic farmers. Because the Bt-producing crops kill some key pests, farmers spray less insecticide to control those pests. This allows beneficial insects to survive. So what this means is that even if herbicides are problematic, at least we're using less of other types of chemicals with GM crops. That's not something that her evidence is discussing. Now, I do make another alternate causality argument in my first speech that explains that there are so many other causes to water pollution in Japan. Again, I want to reiterate that she is not solving for this evidence. She says that she solves for the biggest part of it, but her evidence only indicates that GMO pollution is a portion of the problem. Her evidence doesn't even indicate that it's the biggest part of the problem. So how can you err on the side of the affirmative? You hold her claims at a high degree of skepticism because of this. Her evidence does not say what she claims it does. Lastly, I want to extend across my time frame argument. Again, if we are on the brink of environmental collapse, her evidence says that this is something that has been happening for over a century, and her evidence was written in 2010. If this is such a bad problem, why isn't the environment collapsing right now? Why aren't we dying now? Thank you.
Can you explain to me your insecticide argument?
Yes. My insecticide argument is that GMO crops require significantly less insecticide chemicals, so that even if the herbicides are poisonous, at least we're using far less insecticide, which are even more toxic.
Okay, where did your cards state that they were more toxic?
This piece of evidence, I'll find it. As time passes, the farmer becomes more and more dependent on chemicals as the only means of pest control, using larger amounts or more severe poisons and getting less benefit. And at this point, Johnson is discussing the use of insecticides on non-GMO crops.
But is the severe poison, is it ever stated in this card that is a severe poison to humans, or just one more severe to insects?
No, the evidence is in the context that it is toxic and poisonous to the environment.
But where is that context at in the card? That it is specific to the environment and humans and not just more poisonous to insects?
That might not be actually a conclusion that is offered in the card as it is presented, but that is the conclusion of the author in the article as a whole.
But you don't state that in the card anywhere.
And this piece of evidence explains that it is more toxic. The article is titled "GMOs Are a Force for Good," and it's on an environmentally concerned website.
Okay. My next question is on the solvency argument.
Yes.
You state that there's always this risk of genetically modified genes being in all plants, correct?
Yes.
But do you state that there's a difference between natural genetic modification and scientific genetic modification?
I explain that because of what we discussed at the very beginning of the debate round after your speech, that the crossbreeding from scientifically modified crops is inevitable.
Okay. Do you read any evidence that states that that's happening in Japan?
Happening in Japan?
Because
no.
you tell me that we're not growing any in Japan.
Right.
But
and
do you
if
tell
that's
me that there's any kind of, have you stated anywhere in evidence that there's cross-contamination that's already happened in Japan?
Well, if we're not growing any in Japan and there's no risk of cross-contamination, I don't see why we would bother doing the plan, because that means we don't need GMO herbicides.
Okay. On the, sorry to jump around, but let's go back to case. Can you explain why these, well, never mind.
So, I'm going to take a second to just explain the disadvantage. My opponent has agreed with me in terms of the uniqueness and the link story here, that right now, the United States farmers are being able to produce and develop genetically modified wheat that is resistant to things like drought, which enables us to grow it in greater amounts and decrease the prices at which we sell it to developing countries. Okay? However, the United States will only allow that wheat to be sold commercially if it thinks that there is a global demand for it. So it looks to the actions of major foreign countries like Japan. If Japan says we are banning imports of genetically modified organisms, that means that the United States will not grow this wheat. Now, she has conceded all of this, so you can't let her make new arguments about it, okay? My argument is that if this happens, we are allowing people in developing countries like Egypt, Indonesia, various countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil, China, who can't grow wheat on their own, to starve because they can't buy this wheat. We need to have this wheat to lower the price on the global market. Okay? Now, this is far worse than her impact claims. She's saying that eventually the ecosystem is going to collapse. We're not sure when, but I can tell you right now that because of little access to food, people are starving to death. So we need to put food on the market that is cheap enough for these people to buy it. Now, she makes 3 arguments against my impact. First, she says that it would contaminate water in these other places. This is not in the countries that can't grow the wheat. It would only contaminate the water in the United States, which at least has enough food to feed itself, right? You can group her second and third arguments. Those are both from pieces of evidence from this man named Rubinson, who explains that genetically modified crops are bad for the environment. Genetically modified crops are being grown right now. So all of his arguments are going to happen regardless. What isn't happening right now is that people aren't growing genetically modified wheat, which is actually a crop that people can eat. Instead, we are focusing on soybeans and other crops in the United States because we can grow genetic modifications of those. We need to focus on wheat because that is what is in demand on the global market and what people can eat in greater quantities. Lastly, GMO advancement is key to solve a number of global problems from White in 2013. Many researchers working on GM crops are in fact trying, never mind, you can ignore that last piece of evidence.
While Jake provides you what appears to be some very convincing arguments why you wouldn't want to pass plan, I want to remind you that he never answers how glyphosate is actually constantly increasing in amount. And the only way that we can ensure we do not have to consistently use these horrible herbicides and other chemicals is to stop using GM products. I tell you that glyphosate is the biggest problem because of how much it's used, and that banning GMOs is the only way to ensure that we can reverse it to hopefully save the water. I also tell you that it's the only way to ensure that humans can stay safe. So let's look specifically to what I'm talking about. Remember where I tell you that these natural genetic modifications are fine because we don't have to use more chemicals for them. It's when humans go in and change it that we have the problem. So these modifications he's talking about that have occurred, those are fine. It is those ones that we are consistently changing with science. Those are bad. That's what I want to stop. And remember that Japan's still bringing in crops, or bringing in imports, so we have to ensure there's no risk of genetically modified crops getting further into Japan. On the advantage, remember that I'm telling you that these pesticides are bad because they don't break down. He never responds to this argument that glyphosate is taking a very long time to break down because we're constantly putting it back in. The only risk to get rid of glyphosate is to pass plans so we can stop using it. Jake doesn't respond to this. Additionally, Jake is saying that it's not the biggest problem, but the card that I read tells you that the glyphosate level is at concerning levels, that it's over the limit, and that it's alarming of how much there is, stating it's the biggest problem. And this study looked specifically at how it impacted humans. Jake's arguments only looked at how it impacted insects. You always want to prefer my evidence that is very specific. On the disadvantage, I want you to remember the cards that tell you that using GM is going to kill people because they are going to have severe health effects, that those farmers won't have any money to buy any food because it destroys their crops and their ability to make money, and that natural crops, what I've been pushing for the entire round, are the best option because they produce more than GM crops produce.
This is what you know about the negatives position in this debate. You know that the United States is developing genetically modified wheat right now that can be grown at very high yields because it is drought resistant, and that if it is allowed in the global market, it will decrease prices at which other countries can buy it so that more people will have access to more food. That is especially important in developing nations, especially in urban developing nations where people can't grow things like wheat. People can't grow food for themselves. They need access to this type of food so that they can eat. Right now, there is a global starvation epidemic. Now, the problem with the plan is that it will signal to the United States that major countries don't want it. If there is not a market for genetically modified wheat, the United States won't bother, and these products won't be sold to those developing nations. Okay? Now, this is a much bigger impact than what they are talking about, what Shanna is talking about. She says that over the next couple of years, some creatures in the water are going to die. I'm telling you that people are going to die, are dying right now because they don't have food. That is a greater magnitude. Let's talk about probability. People are definitely dying right now. You see it on the news every day. We don't know when the ecosystem is going to collapse or if it's going to, which brings me to time frame. Again, her evidence that there's going to be a collapse was written in 2010. People are starving to death right now, which means my impact is much, much more significant. She says that genetic modifications kill people, but she doesn't explain the health effects. You know what kills people? Starvation. And that's something that we can at least fix in the short term by selling them this GM wheat. That is the only argument that she makes about the wheat disadvantage in her last speech, other than the environmental damage, which I say is inevitable because other types of genetic modification crops are being grown right now, like soybeans all over the world. Now, on her ecosystems advantage. She says I don't respond to her glyphosate buildup arguments. I definitely do. If glyphosate builds up and does not break down in the water, that means that it is there to stay, regardless of if we ban GMOs or not. That glyphosate isn't going anywhere. So the Japan water supply is always going to be a problem, even if we don't ban GMOs. Now, we can, even if we don't ban GMOs. Now, my Johnson evidence explains that glyphosate is, even if there is this problem, it is still much better than other more extreme chemicals. Finally, I explain that there is no time frame to her impacts, so we need to focus on feeding people.
At the end of the round, you're going to vote for the affirmative for 3 reasons. The first is because I tell you that using genetically modified wheat and other crops is going to continue to contaminate the water and destroy not only the water ecosystems, but the land ecosystems as well. The second reason is that I am more specific in the analysis that I am giving you, and my cards are specific to human beings, not just to insects. You're always going to prefer the most specific scenarios to nebulous arguments that are not clear coming from Jake. And the final reason you'll vote for me is because my case solves for not only my advantage, but also solves for the scenario that Jake talks about with people dying and starving. Let's get to why. The first is on the case. The only risk of being able to get rid of glyphosate is to stop using it. Jake concedes that I tell you that it slowly breaks down, and the problem is how much we're continuing to use. When we stop using it, we no longer allow it to build up, so it gets to eliminate itself and completely disappear. Additionally, I tell you that glyphosate is the biggest problem, and that it's bad for humans, and that it's already at really bad levels. He doesn't answer any of this. I also tell you that this has caused us to be at the brink of seeing problems with the environment that we could not predict because we've never lost this many species before. Jake doesn't respond to this. He also doesn't respond when I tell you that the natural seeds and the natural crops are the way that to produce more, to not contaminate the water, and to be able to save the countries that Jake is wanting to talk about. That these uses of GM products are actually lies by companies to make more money, which means you never want to vote for Jake because you're only going to cause more problems and cause more people to suffer by trying to get this GM wheat to happen. I'm telling you that not allowing GM wheat to happen, by sending that signal that Japan is starting the stance against GMs, which will cause a lot of other countries to follow suit, is the only way to ensure that we save our water, like my Rubinson evidence says, and the only way to save the small farmers as well. Thank you.
So I first want to thank both Jake and Shanna for a wonderful debate. I thought they did a great job in demonstrating how the debate process works. So again, thank you. And I'll just have a couple of comments because we can talk more about some of the specific things later. But what I wanted to highlight or point out is first, did you notice how the debaters used even if arguments quite a bit? So even if I don't win this, I can win this argument. That's a very, very important structure of an argument, because you always are trying to win your arguments, but if by chance the other side happens to beat you on one argument, then you can rely or fall back upon an additional argument. So it's a very strong way to frame and structure your arguments. The other thing I really want to point out that I thought they did an excellent job of was comparing each other's evidence. Starting all the way in the beginning, the first negative constructive speech, Jake talks about Shanna's affirmative evidence. He points out how some of the evidence talks about alternate causes to the problem and that sort of thing. And then in the second affirmative speech, Shanna uses her evidence to refute some of the things that he's talking about and uses some of his own evidence against him. So, and then this happens throughout the entire debate, which I think they did an excellent job of. As you noticed in the last two speeches, which is where they're supposed to emphasize and talk about why they win the debate, both of the debaters talk about why their evidence is better on those key points. So this comparison of evidence and the contrast of evidence between both sides of the debate is very, very important. I also want to suggest that you take note of how they used reasons from their evidence, from each other's evidence, as well as their evidence that they read earlier on in the debate to extend their own positions. So when they get to the second affirmative speech, Shanna doesn't read a whole lot of evidence. She reads a couple of pieces of evidence in the 2AC, but she doesn't have to read a whole lot of evidence because she can rely on her very first speech and the evidence that was in that first speech. She extends those arguments and she extends that evidence and she relies on that evidence so that it frees up her time to then answer and refute Jake's off-case position, which is the wheat disadvantage. Jake does the same sort of thing. He reads a lot of evidence in his first speech, but then in his second negative speech and in the first negative rebuttal, he does read a little bit, but he doesn't have to read a lot because some of his best evidence is already in that first speech. So this is a way you can maximize your time and how you can highlight the importance of some of your key arguments even early on in the debate. I also want to point out how the cross-examination occurred. They did two things, which I know we talked about earlier today, which I thought they did very well. The first is they asked clarification questions. Could you explain your wheat disad? And can you explain how you solve for these ecosystems? And then they asked questions about getting admissions to certain arguments, setting up the arguments that they knew they were going to make. So Jake knew that he was going to run the wheat disadvantage, so he set up in that first cross-examination some questions to try to get Shanna to admit to some things that would help him later on. Then, after Jake gave his first speech, Shanna did the exact same thing. And it wasn't just asking clarification because they didn't understand the arguments, because clearly they did understand the arguments. But they would ask for clarifications, get an admission from those clarification questions, and then use that later on in their speeches. So very effective use of cross-examination. And I also should point out that they did it in a very civil, polite way. They were not mean, they were not jerks to one another. So you can have a very effective cross-examination without resorting to bullying or being nasty with one another. The last thing I want to point out is it's interesting to see, at least I thought it was interesting to see, how both debaters really tried to advance and extend their case, their perspective of the debate, while also trying to minimize the other side. That's part of that comparison process that we talked about earlier, particularly in those last two rebuttals. Jake clearly wants us to vote for him because he's run this wheat disadvantage. Now that's separate from what she runs in that first speech, right? That which is her case. So he wants us to pay attention to his perspective, which is that wheat disadvantage, while at the same time trying to minimize the impacts arguments, the advantage arguments that the affirmative has made. Shanna, in her last speech, does the exact same thing, obviously different kinds of arguments, but she does the same sort of strategy. She emphasizes her first affirmative constructive all the way through the debate. She's always, always, always emphasizing it, reinforcing these arguments. And then she spends most of her time, doesn't she, in that last speech talking about her case arguments. And then she says, oh, and this disadvantage thing over here, it's not that important. What I am talking about is really the most important thing in this debate. So she uses that refutation tactic of mitigating and minimizing her opponent while maximizing and amplifying her arguments and perspectives. So again, very, I thought, excellent demonstration of how to use some of the things that we've been talking about the past couple of days. It's all coming together now. So we can see how the debate process actually works. Obviously, you have a partner, and they're debating by themselves, so that's a little different. But other than that, this is the kind of thing that you will all be doing. And I hope that you learned from this demonstration debate. And we can certainly talk more about some of the specifics later. Okay?